Picture this: Namirembe Cathedral, Kampala, Uganda. February 1977. More than 4,500 people have gathered for a memorial service. Outside the cathedral, a grave has been dug, placed deliberately and carefully next to the grave of martyred Bishop Hannington, who gave his life for Uganda nearly a century before. The moment carries enormous weight, but there is no body. A man had been shot through the mouth and the chest 11 days ago. His body had been placed in a sealed coffin and secretly transported by soldiers to a village more than 250 miles away, where it was dumped in a hurriedly dug grave in the dark. The government did not want him buried with dignity. They did not want him buried as a martyr. They did not want what always happens when you kill a man like this. At the end of the Eucharist, the 4,500 people file outside. They gather around the empty grave, and they begin to sing Easter hymns. Then a woman came through the cathedral carrying armfuls of flowers, walking past grieving bishops who had spent 11 days trying to understand what had just happened. She looked around at all of it: the grief, the empty grave, the silence. Those who were there later recalled that it was Janani Luwum, his widow of 28 years, who said quietly, "This is going to put us 20 times forward, isn't it?" 11 days before that service, a dictator had killed an archbishop. Amin had done it to silence a voice that refused to be silenced. Amin had done it to prove that no one, not even the head of the Anglican Church in 4 countries, was above his power. Amin had done it to end something. What he did not know is that the thing he was trying to end had been started 29 years earlier by the man himself, on the very day he was saved. And it was far too late to stop. His name was Janani Luwum, the Archbishop of the Church of Uganda, Rwanda, Burundi, and Boga Zaire. A goatherd from northern Uganda who became one of the 10 20th century martyrs standing in stone above the west door of Westminster Abbey. The courage he showed on February 16, 1977 was not something he found in that moment. It was something he had been building, quietly, deliberately, at cost, since January 6, 1948. Comment below with all things work together for good if you are trusting God in a situation that does not look like it is working together for good yet. Stay to the end, where we reveal the hidden disciplines that built a man who meant those words for 29 years, which will enable you to run with endurance the race set before you. Janani Luwum, his full name was Janani Luwum, was born in 1922 in the village of Mucwini, Kitgum district, in the far north of Uganda, near the border with Sudan. His father's name was Elia Okello, himself a convert to Christianity, a man who had made his own faith decision and built a household on it. His mother's name was Irene Akiro. He grew up herding goats in an Akoli village. By any earthly measure, he was nobody remarkable, poor, rural, surrounded by a faith he had inherited but not yet owned. As a young man, he trained as a teacher at Boroboro. He attended church. He was, as one account puts it, not at this time a converted Christian. His faith was nominal, present in form, absent in fire. But what was not absent was hunger. As a boy, Janani Luwum walked 80 miles to attend high school in a town called Gulu. 80 miles on foot for an education, in a country where most simply went without. That walk would matter decades later, when he was consecrated as Bishop of Northern Uganda in Gulu, the same town he had once walked 80 miles to reach. On January 6, 1948, an Acholi couple named Yusto Otunu and his wife, themselves transformed through the East African revival, shared their testimony with a young teacher named Janani. The East African revival had been sweeping through Uganda, Kenya, Rwanda, and Tanzania since the 1920s, producing communities of Christians who met daily to confess their sins openly before each other, to live in radical transparency, and to refuse the small compromises that religion usually accommodates. It was a movement built on public honesty. What it produced, over time, was public courage. He felt convicted once, broke out in a heavy sweat. A second time, then a third, and he confessed Jesus Christ as his Lord. In tears, out loud, in public. His neighbors came running from surrounding homes, alarmed by the sound. He was 25 years old. He was a school teacher, and nothing that came after was the same. He spoke immediately. The same day. Today I have become a leader in Christ's army. I am prepared to die in the army of Jesus, as Jesus shed his blood for his people. If it is God's will, I do the same. He was not speaking about a distant theoretical martyrdom. He had no congregation, no platform, no idea what God would ask of him. He was making a covenant, before he had any idea how literally God would hold him to it. He turned evangelist that same week. He warned against drink, tobacco, and sin. He disturbed the peace. Within months of his conversion, local chiefs had him detained for the noise, for the preaching that disturbed the village's sense of order. He was released. He went back to preaching. Civil and church authorities had told him to stop. He had kept going anyway. The trajectory was immediate. Declaration, then cost, then detention. He was 25 years old. This was simply the first iteration of what would become the pattern of his life. He left teaching entirely. No career, no salary, no security in a poor country. Surrendered without hesitation. He climbed termite mounds at dawn to preach. He became known as the crazy man of God. He had no idea how sane he was. He married Mary Lawinyo. Together they would have 9 children. She was already beside him when he entered Bualasi Theological College in January 1949. She would outlive him by more than 40 years. She would watch him martyred and keep speaking of it as a man who had prepared. The 9 children grew up with a father who had told them, from their earliest years, who he was. A man prepared to die in the army of Jesus. He entered Bualasi Theological College in January 1949. He came back a catechist. In 1953, he returned for ordination training. Ordained deacon, December 21, 1955. Ordained priest a year later. He rose before dawn, in the hours when the house was still and dark, for extended hours of prayer, fasting, and scripture saturation. These were not the disciplines of a man performing religion. They were the disciplines of a man building something he would eventually need. The infrastructure of these private years was what would hold him upright when the public tests came. He served in the Upper Nile Diocese. In 1962, after a year of study in England at St. Augustine's, Canterbury, and the London College of Divinity, he was appointed vice principal of Bualasi Theological College. In 1965, principal. In 1966, provincial secretary of the Church of Uganda, Rwanda, Burundi, and Boga Zaire. 21 years between his conversion and his first episcopal appointment. Every role mastered before the next was given. Catechist to deacon, to priest, to student, to vice principal to provincial secretary. No shortcuts, no platform seeking, no impatience with the slow work of formation. The pre-dawn prayer hours, the years of teaching theology students, the bicycle rides to remote congregations, the pastoral care of a diocese too poor to pay its pastors. None of it was glamorous. All of it was necessary. This is what God is doing when he keeps a man in the hidden place longer than the man thinks is necessary. On January 25, 1969, Janani Luwum was consecrated and enthroned as Bishop of Northern Uganda in Gulu, the same town to which, as a boy, he had walked 80 miles for an education. In the congregation that day sat the Prime Minister of Uganda and Major General Idi Amin, then commander of the Army and Air Force, who had himself come to faith briefly and who had asked Luwum to baptize his children. Neither man knew what the other would eventually become to them. As bishop, his ministry was holistic and tireless. Evangelism, Bible translation, schools, health centers, a hospital, a dairy farm. He inherited a diocese where pastors were too poor to minister and grew vegetables instead of preaching. He organized. He refused to treat a struggling church as a reason to give up. In 1973, a young judge named John Sentamu was posted to Gulu, an area devastated by political violence and military oppression, with more widows and orphans than anywhere else in Uganda. Luwum told him, "We must be Christ to these people, be their advocate and take up their cases. The local prison is filled to capacity with innocent people." Sentamu did exactly that, and was later imprisoned himself for it. He eventually fled to England and said, "The day Luwum died, I resolved to be ordained." He later became the Archbishop of York, the second highest position in the Church of England. The men Luwum shaped became the leaders who carried the church forward. On January 25, 1971, exactly 2 years after Luwum's consecration, the same date, Idi Amin staged a military coup and crowned himself dictator of Uganda. His first targets included the Acholi people, Luwum's own tribe. Between 100,000 and 500,000 people would die under his regime. The officer who had sat in the pew at Luwum's consecration had made himself the most feared man in the country. In May 1974, Luwum was elected the third Archbishop of the province of the Church of Uganda, Rwanda, Burundi, and Boga Zaire. He accepted not in a season of triumph, but in the middle of a reign of terror. High visibility under Idi Amin was not an honor, it was a target on one's back. He accepted it anyway. As Archbishop, Luwum regularly went personally to the State Research Bureau, Amin's secret police headquarters, a place where people went in and often did not come out, where the sounds of interrogation could be heard from the street, where ordinary Ugandans would cross to the other side of the road rather than walk past the door. He walked through that door repeatedly to plead for the lives of prisoners he had never met. Every visit was a possible last visit. He went anyway. He initiated a meeting with all religious leaders, Christians and Muslims, to speak with one voice against human rights abuses. They resolved to request a direct meeting with Amin. Amin marked him as his arch-enemy and began to monitor him. At Christmas 1976, Luwum preached a sermon on national radio describing the regime's violence with unusual directness. Government censors cut the broadcast mid-sentence. The message had already gone out. In the final year of his life, Luwum said something to those closest to him that showed he understood exactly what was happening. "I do not know how long I shall occupy this chair. I live as though there will be no tomorrow. While the opportunity is there, I preach the gospel with all my might, and my conscience is clear before God." He was not performing dramatic courage. He was describing his daily posture. On Sunday, January 30, 1977, Bishop Festo Kivangere preached on the preciousness of life to an audience including high government officials, denouncing the arbitrary bloodletting and accusing the government of abusing the authority God had entrusted to it. The government responded the following Saturday, February 5th, at 1:30 in the morning. Soldiers crashed through the gates of the Archbishop's residence, weapons raised, ostensibly searching for hidden arms. Luwum looked at the guns and said, "My only weapon is the Bible. Our house is the house of God. We pray for the president. We preach the gospel. That is our work." They found no weapons, but the message had been delivered. The regime saw him and was coming. That day, within days of the raid, Luwum and the bishops of Uganda issued a pastoral letter addressed to Amin, signed by nearly all the bishops. It was not a vague appeal for peace. It named what was happening. It named the State Research Bureau, Amin's torture chambers, where Ugandans disappeared and came back broken or did not come back at all. It named the mass slaughter of Acholi and Langi soldiers in military barracks, Luwum's own people, being systematically liquidated inside the army. It named the climate of terror that had silenced the nation. It called the president to account before God and before the church. It was not a diplomatic letter. It was an indictment. Luwum personally delivered it. He had been offered rescue. The British offered him exile. He refused. Jesus himself didn't run away from being crucified. His wife Mary pleaded with him to flee. He told her he would not watch this catastrophe from a terrace. He would stay with his flock. On February 13th, after midnight, Amin called, ranting. Luwum answered and listened. The next day, February 14th, Amin summoned him to a meeting, greeted him with smiles, and had a photographer document the occasion. Then, in the same meeting, he produced a letter, forged, claiming to prove Luwum's involvement in a plot against the regime. The state media broadcast the accusation across Uganda. The smiling photograph was the trap's cover. Luwum understood exactly what was happening. He showed up anyway. But what you have not yet seen is what Amin had prepared for February 16th, 1977. Because this was not just an arrest. It was a staged spectacle, with 3,000 soldiers and forced onlookers assembled at Nile mansions, a forged letter, selected witnesses, the full apparatus of the state, aligned to prove publicly that the Archbishop was a traitor and that his faith had not protected him. And Janani Luwum walked into that room knowing exactly what was waiting. And the question is not whether he was afraid. The question is how a man reaches the place where fear does not change what he does. Before we follow Archbishop Luwum into that room, a quick word. This story took weeks of research to uncover. Work our members make possible. If you would love to be part of this community that ensures these hidden legacies are told, and told well, hit the join button on the channel homepage. You will not just be a member, you will be standing in the same spirit as the witnesses themselves, and encouraging many others to run with endurance the race God has set before them. On February 16th, 1977, Amin summoned religious, government, and military leaders to Kampala. Luwum and 6 other bishops were publicly arraigned in a show trial, accused of smuggling arms and plotting a coup. Amin had assembled approximately 3,000 soldiers and forced onlookers. Soldiers chanted for the firing squad. A forged letter confirming Luwum's guilt was produced and read aloud. It was transparently fabricated. Everyone present knew it. It did not matter. As the church leaders were ordered to leave one at a time, Luwum was detained. As he was separated from his fellow bishops, he turned to Bishop Festo Kivangari and said calmly, "They are going to kill me. I am not afraid. I see God's hand in this." Then to all his brothers, "Do not be afraid." He said it the way a man who had known for 29 years that this was coming would say it. He had rehearsed it on the day of his conversion. He was not discovering courage in that moment. He was deploying something he had been carrying for decades. Before the vehicle came, Luwum was permitted to pray briefly with 4 other prisoners who were also awaiting execution. His last act as a free man was to pastor people who were about to die. Then he was placed in a Land Rover, and he was not seen alive again. The next day, February 17th, a government spokesperson claimed the Archbishop had died in a car accident. His body was eventually returned in a sealed coffin. When the family was permitted to see it, the wounds told the truth the regime had been trying to contain. Bullet holes through the mouth and chest. Amin's own Minister of Health, Dr. Henry Kayemba, who later published his memoirs in State of Blood, wrote, "The Archbishop had been shot through the mouth and had at least 3 bullets in the chest. A named witness, with a name, with a book, with no reason to lie after Amin fell. 2 cabinet ministers, Charles Oboth Ofumbi and Oryema, both committed Christians, were murdered alongside the Archbishop that same night. Soldiers transported Luwum's body approximately 250 miles north to Mucwini, his birthplace, and buried it secretly in a hurriedly dug grave at the churchyard at Gweng on February 19, 1977. They were afraid of what his grave might become. They were right to be afraid. At Namirembe Cathedral, The grave had been dug next to Bishop Hannington's. The government refused to release the body. The congregation filed outside to an empty hole in the ground and sang Easter hymns around it, as if they knew something about empty graves. Then Mary Luwum walked through the room of grieving bishops carrying armfuls of flowers and said what they were too close to see. "This is going to put us 20 times forward, isn't it?" 28 years beside this man had taught her to read the grain of wheat. The following June, 25,000 Ugandans gathered in the capital for the centennial celebrations of the first preaching of the gospel in Uganda. Luwum had been designated as the main celebrant for this service. He was murdered during the preparations. The celebration came without him, and among the 25,000 were many who had left the faith and came back because they had watched the Archbishop walk into that room without flinching. Idi Amin's regime was destroyed by invading Tanzanian forces in 1979. He fled into exile and died there. Luwum was killed in February 1977. The regime he died opposing collapsed 2 years later. Bishop Festo Kivangere, who had last heard Luwum say, "I see God's hand in this," fled Uganda immediately after the martyrdom. In exile, he wrote a book titled "I Love Idi Amin." The title was not a provocation. It was the most devastating possible response. The church that Amin had tried to destroy had found a way to refuse hatred. That was not weakness. It was Luwum's theology lived out in the man who had stood closest to him. In 1998, 10 statues of 20th century Christian martyrs were unveiled above the west door of Westminster Abbey. One of them is Janani Luwum, the goatherd from Mucwini, the boy who walked 80 miles for an education, the man who was detained within months of his conversion and kept preaching anyway, standing in stone alongside Dietrich Bonhoeffer, Martin Luther King Jr., and Oscar Romero. In 2015, Uganda declared February 16th, the day Amin killed him, a national public holiday, Saint Janani Luwum Day. Amin tried to erase him. The nation made him permanent. Disciplines. And here is what built the courage. Janani Luwum did not walk into that room at Nile Mansions as a man who had decided, in the moment, to be brave. He walked in as a man who had been building something for 29 years, and what waited for him in that room was simply the last question in a very long examination. The first discipline was public repentance as the root of public courage. The East African revival was not primarily about emotion. It was about radical honesty. Daily public confession of sin, meeting with others to name what you had done wrong before God and before witnesses. Luwum's conversion was public, weeping out loud in front of his village. That habit of honesty, the discipline of not hiding what was true, grew over 29 years into the courage that could stand before a dictator and say what was true there too. The courage to sign the pastoral letter grew from the same soil as the courage to confess sin in public at age 25. The second discipline was leaving the small life when the call is clear. He had a teaching career, stable, respected, in a country where educated professionals were scarce. He left it the week he was converted. Not years of discernment, not delayed obedience, immediate response. The discipline of saying yes while the call is still ringing is rarer than it sounds. Most people hear a call from God and negotiate the timing. Luwum did not negotiate. The third discipline was 21 years of invisible faithfulness. From conversion in 1948 to his first episcopal appointment in 1969, 21 years of quiet obedience. Catechist, deacon, priest, student in England, vice principal, principal, provincial secretary. Every role mastered before the next. The man who could stand before Amin was assembled in those invisible years, piece by piece, role by role, without any audience. The fourth discipline was staying when every reason says go. He was offered exile. Mary pleaded. He refused to watch from a terrace. The discipline of choosing the flock over personal safety had been built so deeply into him by years of repetition by every walk into the State Research Bureau, by every stay when he could have left, that when the final test came, it was simply the next repetition of what he had always done. The fifth discipline was keeping your word for 29 years. On January 6, 1948, he said, "I am prepared to die in the army of Jesus." On February 16, 1977, he walked into a room that would kill him and proved he had meant every word. The discipline is not the heroic moment at the end. The discipline is the 29 years in between, the daily choices that kept the covenant he had made with God on the day of his conversion. That is the story of Janani Luwum. He did not become brave on February 16, 1977. He became brave on January 6, 1948, and spent the next 29 years making good on what he said. The moment of martyrdom was the last sentence of a story that had been written one day at a time, in the detention cell and the prayer room and the principal's office and the State Research Bureau in the pre-dawn hours. All things work together for good, Paul wrote, to those who love God. Mary Luwum walked through a cathedral of grief carrying flowers and said it out loud. The diocese that Amin tried to silence was put 20 times forward. The bishop's friend who had fled into exile wrote a book called I Love Idi Amin. The judge who had been imprisoned chose ordination. The nation declared a public holiday. Comment below with all things work together for good. If you are trusting God right now in a situation that does not look like it is working together for good, because the woman who said it first had just buried her husband, and she said it anyway, don't forget to hit that notification bell. Like and subscribe to Cloud of Witnesses for more life-changing stories of faith that will equip you to boldly fulfill the call of God in your life. This week's challenge: find the small version of Luwum's discipline in your own life. Not the dramatic version, the ordinary one. Where is the pre-dawn prayer room? Where is the letter that names the truth no one wants named? Where is the choice between the terrace and the flock? Name it, and stay. The final witness in this Cloud of Witnesses series is a man who was kidnapped by Boko Haram in January 2020. They filmed him. What he said on camera, in the hands of terrorists, is the story of a man who had been preparing for exactly that moment his entire life. His name was Lawan Andimi. Check out this next video to discover how a man who led 800 churches across northeast Nigeria spoke on a phone from captivity about the sovereignty of God, and meant every word.